verse 21 through 24 of Mark to start this off. So, verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. And he went with him. I'm just going to take just a second to talk about what a literary device that Mark uses throughout the gospel. And we talked about it when we did our little introduction Sunday background context on Mark, that he uses a literary device called intercalation, but really it's usually referred to as a Markan sandwich. And what he does, if you've never heard that before, I didn't know anything about it, but he introduces story A, the first slice of bread. He interrupts it with story B, the meat, and then goes back and finishes story A. And he does that over and over again. There's about 10 examples, 15 examples of that in Mark. And if you have, and there's books written on this and videos and sermons. But whenever you see a list of these Markan sandwiches, they always have this one as an example because it's so clear what he does. So you'll see, he introduces the Jairus and his daughter, and then we'll shift in the middle to another story, and then it will come back and finish that one. So, and there's a lot of discussion and study of why does he do this, or why was he inspired by the Holy Spirit to write this way? How does it help improve our understanding of what we're supposed to learn? So maybe we can pick some things out of this story to increase our understanding by examining that literary device. And just the key to understanding these Markan sandwiches is the middle story. I'll just say that. So the other thing I'll point out, because it is pointed out a lot of times, and you probably should be aware, that this story about Jairus and his daughter is in all three synoptic gospels. It's in Matthew and Luke, Matthew chapter 9, Luke chapter 8. A lot of times, and maybe you're familiar with this is pointed out as a potential contradiction, because in Matthew chapter 9, verse 18, when Jairus comes to Jesus, he says that his daughter is already dead. She's near death, and can he come heal her? So I'll just read Matthew 9:18 just to. Maybe it's not 9:18.
Is it 8:19?
Maybe it's 8:19. Anyway, I've got the wrong, but Matthew.
It's 9:18.
Matthew. Is that it?
Yeah. Okay, I was just reading wrong. While he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hands on her and she will live. So, in Mark it says, of course, my little daughter is at the point of death. So is this a contradiction? And the answer, of course, anytime we really dig into these things that people point out as contradictions, we find out that it's not, that it's either some translation issue or something else. And the word that, the Greek word that Mark uses here is eschatos, which translated last, utmost, extreme. She's at the last, she's at the utmost or extreme. It's where we get the word eschatology from, which is the study of last things or the study of the end. And in Matthew, there's a slightly different word used. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Greek word, but it's translated, has just come to the point of death. And so, I mean, people love to make hay out of pointing out contradictions of the Bible, and I'm just pointing it out in case you didn't know, if you ever hear someone talking about this, that there are, you know, if you examine the Greek root words and the context and the, you know, there's really no contradiction. Jairus has probably been told by the physician that there's nothing more I can do, you know, she's good, and he leaves and goes looks for Jesus, and so in his mind, you know, maybe she's died while he's left, which is in fact what the people come and tell him. So anyway, no contradiction, but you will see this in a list of supposed contradictions that people will point out in the Bible. And the other thing that I'll point out that's kind of interesting, you know, Jairus is a ruler of the synagogue. I'm not sure exactly what that means. He's not a rabbi, he doesn't preach, but he manages the synagogue, or he orders the services, he probably maintains a scroll room, sets a schedule. So he's in the synagogue in Capernaum, and so he's very familiar with Jesus. Obviously, he knows, he may have even witnessed the miracle where he healed the man with the withered hand there. He knows also the pushback that Jesus is getting from the Pharisees, scribes, the religious leaders. He's aware of that, controversies. So he's taking something of a public risk by going and showing his faith in Jesus. We know there's other examples of Jewish leaders in the Bible who were followers of Jesus or who believed in him, but they did it secretly because they knew the antipathy that the establishment had against them. For example, Nicodemus, you know, came to Jesus only under the cover of night, John 3:2. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. And Joseph of Arimathea, also apparently a follower, but secretly for fear of the Jews, it says in John 19:38, after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission, so he came and took away his body. So there was some fear that you'd be thrown out of the synagogue, or which was a big deal in that day. You know, that was the community. And these religious leaders, even though they believed that Jesus had come from God, they were afraid of doing that publicly, saying that publicly. But Jairus is desperate. His daughter's near death. And so as these people are crowding around Jesus, he comes to them publicly. He says, come lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. So I'll just keep reading verse 24 through 28. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garment, I will be made well. So this is the insertion of the second story in the middle. And, you know, you can see a lot of contrast between these two people. You know, Jairus is named, and he's probably somebody who's fairly wealthy or prominent. The woman, we're not even told her name. She's probably an outcast. If you read all the prohibitions, I mean, this condition that she had would, you know, according to the Levitical law, Leviticus 15, you can read the whole chapter that it prescribes all these things with regard to discharge of blood, but it's almost the same as we've read about what lepers had to do. You know, they had to announce that they were unclean. If they touched anyone or their clothes, then it was unclean, and they were prescribed all these things that you had to do to become clean. So she suffered from this for 12 years, so she's essentially an outcast. I mean, and like Candace, I think, said that, you know, when we were talking about the lepers, you know, it's not just the condition that would create, you know, the trauma or the problem. It's the being ostracized and separated, you know, the social distancing, extreme social distancing, which would just make this a, you know, horrible situation to be in. And of course, she'd spent all her money, and physicians could do nothing. It was hopeless, and of course, they probably made it worse, it said. So she can't come up to him and get in line with all the people who have ailments, you know, and ask to be healed like they did, because she can't touch him, he can't touch her, you know. She knows all these prohibitions, how she would make him unclean, etc. But she has faith. She knows, she's heard about him. She knows he can heal. So she's thinking, if I can just touch his garment, just push through the crowd, touch his garment, I'll be healed. So is that kind of superstitious or pagan in a way? Probably, but I mean, it shows how much she believed. So her faith that if I can just touch his garment, I'll be made well. I'll just read what Matthew Henry, just one sentence in the thing he was talking about, just to kind of summarize what I just said. Her case was such as she could not in modesty tell him publicly as others did their grievances, and therefore a private cure was what she wished for, and her faith was suited to her case. So she pushes through the crowd, touches his garments, and then it says, verse 29 through 34, and immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And the first thing I'll say is kind of interesting. We've seen several times where we're kind of surprised that the disciples kind of have mild rebukes of Jesus. This one is not even really, I mean, it's really kind of rude, and, you know, you're asking who touched you, or, you know, we've got this crowd pushing in on us. the real interesting thing about it is, and you'll remember that we talked about repeatedly how Mark is essentially Peter's recollections of all these things. Mark is transcribing what Peter has preached and taught, and he's heard these stories over the years. And so in Mark's gospel, it said the disciples make this rebuke, right? You see this great crowd and you ask who touched you. If you go and look at the account in the other synoptics, who do you think it says actually said that? It doesn't just say the disciples. Peter. It says it was Peter who said that. So it's just one more little clue or circumstantial. You know, when Peter tells this story over and over again, he doesn't say I'm the one who asked that smart aleck question. You know? He says we asked him that. Anyway.
Poor Peter.
Matthew's account is a lot shorter. You know, we've talked about how Mark is the short gospel for a lot of reasons, and that he's fast-paced, and a lot of times he's just one or two sentences, and then the other gospels go into more detail. But it's interesting. I was reading it. Matthew's 28 chapters, Mark 16. If you take out the 5 discourses, the long discourses out of Matthew, Sermon on the Mount, the discourse on the church, the Olivet discourse, etc. If you take those out, what remains, 90% of Mark is in Matthew, but you take the discourses out, Matthew actually is shorter than Mark. But Mark does not include those long discourses like chapter 5, 6, 7, the Sermon on the Mount that's in Matthew. So he looks around to see who had done it. The woman, now you can think, the woman has kind of tried to privately push her way through the crowd, touch his garment with the faith that all it would take would be that, and she would be healed, and she is healed. And now he turns around and says, who touched me? You can imagine now she would be afraid. You know, she might be, she knows Jesus can heal, but she doesn't know how kind or anything else he is, so she might be thinking, I just touched him, I just made him unclean, he's 24 hours and all this. But she does, you know,
confess.
She does fess up, and she tells him the whole truth. So she probably told him this whole story. I mean, it's been 12 years, physicians, all my money. And he says to her, daughter, your faith has made you well, go in peace and be healed of your disease. And that's the only time in the Bible that Jesus bestows the name daughter on anyone. And the thing I was reading, and it makes sense, it's by calling her daughter in this public situation, it's saying, you belong with all the other people that believe in me and believe in the Father. I mean, it's like welcoming her back from this 12 years of isolation. So I'll just pause there to see if anyone has anything that you're aware of to add to this, comment or question or anything that we've talked about before we go into the second slice of bread of the sandwich, where we'll wrap up the story of Jairus.
Does Luke also have all those long discourses?
You can, like elements of the Sermon on the Mount, you'll find them in Matthew and Luke, but they're not, Mark and Luke. Matthew, of course, it's just continuous, 5, 6, and 7. You'll see the elements in Luke, but they're not laid out like he was given one long sermon.
Okay.
I was really just buying for time so I could get a drink of water. Nobody has anything. So now we'll go through the end, verse 35 through 43. And there's a lot here to talk about. Let me just read the verses. So while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. I've got 5 or 6 notes that we'll talk about. I think it's interesting. This is the first time that the inner circle of apostles are kind of named and singled out by Jesus. Peter, James, and John. There's 3 other instances where these 3 are called forward. There's this one. And then, of course, you remember we talked about it. These are the 3 that are eyewitnesses on the Mount of Transfiguration. These are the 3 that he says, "Come up on the mountain with me," and they see him in his glory. And then in the Garden of Gethsemane, all the apostles and disciples are there, but he calls these 3 forward to him, with him, when he goes forward to pray, and he tells them to watch and to pray. They're the only ones that are given nicknames, if that has any significance. When they're appointed, we went through this in Mark chapter 3, verse 16, 17, he appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, and James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. So these are the only ones that we know Jesus gave nicknames to, or named, and they are in this inner circle. So I don't know, maybe some of you have read, I'm sure there's different theories on why these became the inner circle. So one thing I read was maybe it's not that they had any specific special attributes, but he just wanted to keep an eye on them because of the way they were. I don't know, but there's one other time, and you may remember on the Olivet Discourse, that these 3 plus Andrew come to him privately, and he explains that, but we'll get to that chapter 13. But these 3 are considered the inner circle. This is the first time that we see that. The second thing, Jesus says she's not dead, she's only sleeping. And he said the same thing when Lazarus had died in John 11:13. After saying these things, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest and sleep. It's interesting. There's a lot of places in the Bible where death is referred to as falling asleep. I've got 1 1 Corinthians 15, 16, 18. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. In 1 Thessalonians 4, 13, 14. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. And here's a little trivia thing that I learned getting ready for this. The word cemetery comes from the Greek word, I won't try to pronounce it, that means sleeping place. So it was not uncommon for this terminology to be, especially among the Christians, early Christians. You know, the cemetery was a place where you'd fallen asleep. And in a serious note, I mean, and here I'm just talking, I didn't read this. Throw this away if it's, but, you know, what happens to us when we die if we believe we're going to be resurrected? And everybody is, either to life or to the second death. So whatever state we're in, you know, is fallen asleep, not literally, but, you know, that terminology may be appropriate. And please, if I've committed a foul, somebody point it out. I was just thinking that, you know, that maybe, you know, I don't know. But then, you know, he says that, and they laugh at him. And, you know, you read that and you might kind of get angry, you know, they're laughing at the Lord. But actually, someone points out it's important that that verse is included there. Because otherwise, you can imagine people would say, well, she just had lost consciousness or slipped into a coma or something, and so he didn't raise her from the dead. She was not dead, she was unconscious or something. But the fact that these people, and you know, I don't know if you've ever learned about this. I've seen it several places, but apparently it was pretty common for people to hire professional mourners, you know, to wail and play the instruments and everything. And I guess it's not unlike what we do when we have a funeral service. I mean, you're showing that this person was of extreme value, you know, and a ruler like Jairus could afford, you know, mourners, and would want to show that this, you know, your daughter has died and it's a horribly tragic thing. And so you've got all these mourners who have certainly seen dead people, and they're all adults there, they've been there, might have even been the physician, a physician. And, you know, they may not have all the medical knowledge we have today, but they know when somebody's dead, when no more respiration, no heartbeat, no reaction to stimulus. So the fact that these people laugh and say, and Luke's account, he even includes, for they knew she was dead. I mean, that's why they laughed, because they knew she was dead. So he puts them outside. That's the way it's translated in English. The Greek word, root word that Mark uses there means to cast someone out forcefully. So he throws them out. He's in somebody else's house, but they laugh at him, he throws them out. And so all that remain are the inner circle, Peter, James, and John, and the parents. And he throws the rest of these guys out, and somebody says, they were unworthy to witness the miracle, for they had been deriding him who wields this power. So he put them outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. So he cast them out forcefully, And then he takes her by the hand and says to her, Talitha Kumi, which means little girl, I say to you, arise. And that's the Aramaic. That's one of a number of times that Mark, who's writing his gospel in Greek, repeats the Aramaic, which is a Hebrew dialect, subdialect. That was the language of Jesus. So he includes the actual Aramaic words that Jesus said. There's a number of places in Mark where he does that. That's one of the things that scholars will point to when they say, talk about Mark and priority, how it was probably written first. That's just part of their theory because of all the Aramaic. But I would ask you, how would Mark know what Jesus said exactly with this handful of people there?
It had to be Peter.
It had to be Peter. This is Peter's version that he's heard over and over again. And we see that take place several times. We mentioned that on the Mount of Transfiguration, how there's clues in there about how in Mark's gospel that account is kind of obviously written from Peter's point of view. And this is just one more little example of that. So Peter was present, heard that. That's how he told the story. And of course he told the Aramaic words, and so Mark includes that. And I just want to read, so this is the account of Jesus raising this girl from the dead. And Peter was present. And I just think this is interesting. I kind of stumbled on this. But I'm going to read Acts 9, 36 through 40. Of course, this is after the crucifixion, resurrection, ascension. And I'll just read these 5 verses. Now there was in Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. She was full of good works and acts of charity. In those days she became ill and died. And when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, urging him, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter rose and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the upper room. All the widows stood beside him, weeping, and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas made while she was with them. But Peter put them all outside and knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. So you can see kind of some similarities there to this raising of someone from the dead. I just thought it was kind of interesting. But back to Mark here. So the last thing I want to talk about is he strictly charged them not to say anything. Strictly charged them no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Now we've seen, and we've talked about several places where he heals someone, he tells them, don't tell people, because he's that idea that we're trying to maintain the messianic secret until the proper time. And this one, and that's just when he's healed someone. He's raised a girl from the dead, and he strictly charges them not to say that. And the thing that's kind of important about this is it was actually the raising of Lazarus, which happens later. It's counted at the end when he's in going to Jerusalem for the final Passover. it was the raising of Lazarus that precipitated the crucifixion. If you read, and I'll just read John 11:45 through 53. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, raise Lazarus, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. So, and then in chapter 12, it even says the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well. So the raising of Lazarus kind of started the end game of them seeking to put him to death. So it's not time for that now. He's in Galilee. It's early in the ministry. And so he strictly charges them not to tell. And the fact that, he's got this small group that witnessed it, and threw the others out, probably helped maintain that secret. They probably didn't go. And so it didn't become an issue like it did when he raised Lazarus. And one last thing that I think is interesting, and it kind of goes to a lot of what we've talked about when dating the different Gospels. I didn't know this. I was surprised to learn it preparing for this. The story of Lazarus is not found in the Synoptic Gospel. It's only in John. So what does that tell us? You'd say, why? This is kind of a big miracle. Why do the synoptics not discuss it? And it goes to, and we've talked about a couple of other examples of this. This is how it kind of relates to dating of the Gospels. The theory is called protective anonymity. In other words, the gospel writers are trying to shield individuals who were still living from persecution by not naming them. If Lazarus was still alive when the synoptic gospels were written but died in the interim between their publication and the composition of John's gospel, this would account for the synoptic non-inclusion of the account, but John's inclusion of it. Lazarus' death would have meant he no longer needed protection from persecution, so that John was free to include the account of his raising from the dead by Jesus. There's some other, good examples. I think one of them we talked about, which is in Mark 14:47, when Jesus is arrested, and it says one of those with him drew a sword and struck the high priest, cut off his ear. One of those with him. He's not named until later in John's gospel. It's said that it was Peter. Well, there's a good reason you wouldn't want to say it was Peter if Peter's still alive, because they would naturally, want to talk to him about striking the high priest's servant with a sword. So, I don't know. I find that interesting. Actually, I was kind of surprised. I didn't realize that it's only in the Gospel of John, but I think it's, again, one of those pieces of circumstantial evidence that kind of helps us know the early dating. And we talk about, early dating is important to us because if these Gospels are written while all the eyewitnesses are still alive, it's different than if you've written them years after they're dead and you can claim that it's just made up, that it's a forgery, or not even, it wasn't even written by the authors that are ascribed to it. So, let me get a drink of water. We got about 120 seconds. Does anybody have any comments or questions about what we've talked about? Yeah.
So I got a comment on the whole death aspect and the sleeping and rest, right? So historically, I mean, especially in our Western culture and Christian culture, we have said, you know, rest in peace, and that is it is a resting place for the future resurrection, right? It's been a very clear understanding throughout Western history that that's what happens after death. But it's more recently that we've had the Eastern ideas of reincarnation and being put back into the earth that people have started cremating, right? And so it's the Eastern idea that someone would get cremated and their ashes be spread, versus the Christian, historical Christian accepted stances, you are buried because someday you will rise again from the dead. And it's interesting when people make plans, like when they die, like, should you be cremated or should you be buried? And biblically, I think there's a really strong argument that you should be buried. And that cremation is actually an Eastern idea. And if we're sticking along with more so the biblical essence, is that, you know, they were put in tombs.
Yeah.
They were put in, and now modern day, we bury historically churches. I mean, you can look around if you ever find you're at Fort Rucker, you know, you can almost do all your land now based off of the churches with the cemetery. You know, it's at the church or cemetery. You can find that, and it's why did the church have cemeteries? Is because of that understanding that we would be raised again from the dead. It's not like a strong thing to hold on to. Like, I don't think people that are being cremated won't.
Sure.
But it's important. It's an important consideration.
No, it is. That's very, very well said too.
I believe in European history, there was cremation done from time to time. It was usually for one conquering general, whatever conquers another, he cremates him. And does various other things and stuff like that. And also there's, if somebody's done a really, really serious crime, they might get cremated too. That's in Europe.
As a punishment that they wouldn't.
Yeah. Well, so are you saying that, I mean, is the theory that because those longer dissertations or talks or whatever, discourses are in Matthew because he was there? I mean, like, so he could write it down, whereas Peter couldn't remember it word for word?
Oh, no, I know what you're saying, but no, that's not. It is true that, I mean, a lot of people have said that Matthew, being a tax collector, would have been literate, would have been able to write in a shorthand. I can't remember what they called it, where they would annotate people's debts and all this. And so he would be the one who would be the most well equipped to make shorthand and record the entire. I have read, you know, that people believe that he did include, for example, the Sermon on the Mount verbatim from having written it. Whereas we know a lot of this stuff is orally passed on. The parables, for example, because they're portable, you can tell these stories. But yeah, I have, but no, that's not what I meant by saying. I was just contrasting the style of Mark versus Matthew. But yeah, the fact that Matthew was a tax collector, literate, fluent in more than one language, and was capable of recording in the shorthand that apparently they used, would mean that he could hear the Sermon on the Mount and make these shorthand notes and then write it verbatim. And it probably wasn't the only time he gave that sermon, so, but anyway.
Okay.
We're 1 minute over, so before the elder tells me to drop and do push-ups, I'll let you guys go to work.